on the 2nd of May this year, Francis Rossi of Status Quo released a new album on CD and double vinyl via EarMUSIC. The Way We Were, Volume 1, is a new album, but it's not one in the traditional sense, but rather it's a collection of 17 demos recorded by Francis Rossi in his home studio during the 2000s. A large selection of these songs would go on to be performed by Status Quo on various albums during that period, and one of which was actually a hit single in 2004. Other songs on here would be retweaked a little bit and included on Francis Rossi's second solo album, One Step at a Time, in 2010. There are 5 recordings on here which are completely unreleased, right? They've never been heard before, a chance to hear new recordings from Francis Rossi from the 2000s. All of the songs on here were written by the songwriting partnership of Francis Rossi and Bob Young, who started writing together again in the 2000s, early 2000s. So this is sort of a record, if you will, of that period of time. Now, when you hear the word demo, it conjures up a bunch of things. We've all heard demos from various artists that are essentially an artist sat there with an acoustic guitar in a really bad sounding room. You know, it's not been prepped for recording at all, and it's a tape recorder, and like it's a little bit dithery in the lyrics because they're just working stuff out. I can tell you that this album is not that. It's not that. These are professional recordings made in a roof somewhere in Surrey studios, Francis' own recording studio. We have proper sounding guitars, proper instruments all put in there. I believe that his son Nicholas is on at least one track, as noted in the booklet, which we shall get to very soon. And of course, Francis is singing on there. The clarity is really good. Some of it you can tell that it's a demo or a rough sketch. Other times you wouldn't know the difference. The only real tell, I guess, is that he is using a drum machine, because when you're working out a song, it's a good idea just to have kind of a generic rhythm there and you can work around it. But to me, that doesn't detract from this album, because I find it really fascinating, and it was great to listen to, because you are hearing those first flourishes of ideas, some of which would go on to be songs that we'd hear on Quo albums, and some of us have heard, hundreds of times. And there it is in its first sketch, sometimes fully formed, sometimes with a different verse or a section that's been added in, or, a lack of solo where there's just a rhythm section there. There's just ideas abound here, some of which would go forward, some of which have stayed on the demo, before it was, as they used to say, quoed up. Now, the album begins on the track Gotta Get Up and Go, which was later recorded by the band on the Party Ain't Over Yet album. And he's got it, right? It's all there. It just needs that band, the band to come in and kind of, as I said, quo it up. And we've got other tracks like Pennsylvania Blues Tonight from In Search of the Fourth Chord. There are sections there that sound like, and this is kind of the interesting thing about this. I think some of the elements from these demos were later used on the finished recordings. The biggest example of this is Tongue Tied, where essentially they've used Francis' original vocal because I think it was seen as something like raw and there's life in that vocal, but the guitar and the arrangement and everything kind of sounds very close to the finished version. In fact, so much so that the algorithm on YouTube is now lumping the demo version of Tongue Tied with the album version from In Search of the Fourth Chord. So it thinks it's the same song or the same recording, which is really interesting. Other songs, I think, like You'll Come Round and Electric Arena, also have these parts where it's like, is there a little bit sort of taken from here and put onto there? I would be very interested to find out. So we have other tracks on here like I Don't Want to Hurt You Anymore. Again, there are bits that are extended on the finished version. Some verses kind of ended a little bit earlier than I was expecting. And of course, there is something quite raw about this. You've got that drum machine in the background. You've got Rossi laying down those rhythms, but the tune is there. And yeah, it's just really interesting to hear the songwriting process. From Francis Rossi's solo career, we also have songs including If You Believe, Tallulah's Waiting, which is a little bit more stripped down. We've got Strike Like Lightning, which is really interesting because it was recorded as a demo, and then it was recorded by Paul Camilleri, who recorded an album with Francis in the late 2000s, and this was one of the songs that he recorded. So it's interesting to hear that original blueprint that was obviously worked off of for his version, and then it was recorded again for Francis' solo album in 2010. Faded Memory is an interesting one because it was released as a single, and I remember at the time it was kind of seen as Quo light, if you will, because it sort of went into those rhythms and things during the chorus, and it sounded like something that Quo would have done. With the demo, it's a different time signature. It's a slightly different tempo. It's a different feel than that. It doesn't sort of change into that chorus in the same way as the finished version. And in some cases, I prefer it. I think this one, I was listening to it and I was like proper bopping and getting into the melody, which is more accentuated here. You're focusing a lot more on the melody than you are on the rhythm and stuff. And I think that is something which Francis has kind of emphasized in the promotion for this album, is that the demo, there's something really magical about those first flushes of the song. It's really relaxed. There's sort of a lot of optimism around it. And yeah, it's just got a certain feel. And I get that wholly from Faded Memory. He did say something very similar about Money Don't Matter as well, which was released as a sort of promo single for this album. And I have seen a couple of people say they prefer this to the finished version, or at least they look at this song differently because this approaches it in a different way. So let's now talk about the 5 unreleased songs. These are ones which have never seen the light of day before, officially. Anyway, I think at least one of them was shared in a tiny part on Bob Young's website many years ago, but this is the first release of all of it. I believe that Can't Change the World wasn't really considered for any project, but it was recorded by an Australian artist some time ago, and that is a good version. It's up on YouTube and it's well worth checking out, and it's very different to the demo which is included on here. Of the other new songs, in inverted commas, we have Why I'm Walking, which is one of those upbeat Rossi Young songs which is very typical in Quo. There's a lot of stuff in there that Quo have either done before, or, it's just in that style that I know that a lot of fans really like. And there's a lot of promise in it. The riff, perhaps, isn't the most original, but the way in which the energy that's in it, and you can just imagine like just getting lost in it. Imagine if it had been quoed up, with Rick playing those rhythm parts and stuff. It probably would have elevated it even more. But the version on here, is a pretty good indication. I mean, I had a huge smile on my face when I first heard it. It felt like I'd lost out on something, if you will. But I'm glad that it's seeing the light of day here, because, I had a big smile on my face. It was just such a good feeling, to hear something new from that songwriting partnership, writing the kind of stuff that I really enjoy, and I'm sure many fans will feel that. And I had even more of that feeling on Load on My Mind. Again, feel like, wow, where was this song? Kind of had moments where it reminds me a little bit of Accident Prone. There's a bit of sort of early 80s, that period between sort of 80 and 82, possibly the latter, with sort of up-tempo, just moving along kind of stuff. The intro to Load on My Mind has a lot in common with Pennsylvania Blues Tonight, and the whole song has sort of reminiscences of other things that Francis and the band have done over the years. That middle eight section has a lot in common with the two-part harmonies that he was doing in the early 80s on tracks like Lies, for example. Maybe that's why I found it so pleasing, because it just felt like a completely lost gem, that just hasn't seen the light of day. In fact, that's exactly what it is. The album ends on Life Has Changed, which compared to the rest of the material is a completely different vibe, completely. Maybe If You Believe has a similarity, but it's a completely different in the main. And that's because it's a little bit more folky, sort of country folk. I mean, I was listening thinking of like Still I Span, Show of Hands, like that sort of area of English folk music, British folk music. It's nice to hear Francis doing something different there, that sort of acoustic vibe where it goes off melodically into very different territory for the singer. It's not going to be to everybody's taste, and I can see why it wasn't used for anything, but it could be reworked, and that's the thing. Like these unused tracks, they could still have a second life. That's just what I got from it. I did read a review, I think it was from Classic Rock, that noted it was a bit sort of Lennon-McCartney-esque. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. But it's an interesting note because it does make you think, well, what else is out there? That's probably the most out there demo on the entire thing. And it does make you think, well, what could be in The Way We Were Volume 2, if there is? I mean, it all depends on the sales, doesn't it? But The Way We Were Volume 1 is a really interesting insight into the songwriting process. We get to hear songs that we've been hearing for 25 years in their earliest incarnations. And that won't suit everybody. Some might be put off by the drum machine, or some might be put off because it's not the same as the versions that we know. There are differences in there, but it is an interesting release, to say the least. Like it's, I really enjoyed listening to it. As an album, each song flows into each other quite nicely. There's sort of a mix of light and shade in there, and some songs stick out to me, those new ones, some of the older ones which are heard in a different light, like Money Don't Matter or You'll Come Round, Tongue Tied, just incredible. Now, I haven't managed to pick up the vinyl version yet, but I have got the CD, which comes in a digipak, and we've got images, we've got artwork, which is really nice, sort of a blue, purpley color, really dark and moody. We've got a picture of a recent photo of Francis Rossi on the front with Francis Rossi of Status Quo. I think that was a really good idea to do that. It might cause a little bit of confusion thinking it's a Quo product, but it says Francis Rossi of Status Quo because a lot of the songs on the back here, are associated with Quo, and then in sort of more handwriting to go with the idea of demo, The Way We Were, Volume 1. Now, if I can offer a bit of critique, is that I do wish that the title had had the word demo in it somewhere, the demos collection, and on digital, all of the songs having like in brackets demo on it, because there is a little bit of confusion there. But on the inside of this product, we've got the disc with a picture of Francis from the 2000s. I'm going to say it's from the late 2000s because no ponytail, but he's still playing the green Telecaster, which of course he sold at auction a few years ago. Now, inside this pack is a little booklet, and little is the word. It's a few pages long, but what this booklet essentially is a few anecdotes from the man himself about the story of the songs, like a little bit of information in there. They're very brief, but you do get an idea of like inspirations or why they've been included here, or perhaps how he feels about the finished versions. A couple of the songs here are said to be inspired by David Walker, for example, the years in which they were working with him. Another one was very funny about where he was showing somebody how he goes through writing songs, and then this song came into his head and he got straight to it, and it turned into a big song for the band. Now, as I say, these are brief, and one thing I would have liked to have seen, which isn't here, is that I would have liked to have seen kind of information on any other musicians who might be playing on here. I know it's mostly Francis. He does note that Nicholas Rossi might be playing on at least one of the tracks, bass on one of the tracks, but I would like to know if there was anyone else there. Probably not. But would have liked a little bit more clarification on that. The other thing is an exact idea as to when a song was recorded. When were these things? I've seen comments over the internet saying, well, he sounds younger. When is this? When was this done? Now, in the booklet, there is, underneath the track, listed the album it would eventually go on to be, which obviously gives you a little bit of a time frame. If it says Heavy Traffic, it's somewhere between sort of 2000 and 2002. If it says, Party or whatever, it's about, maybe a month to 18 months or more in some cases. There's a few where he says that it was when he first started writing with Bob, and you're like, but that song didn't come out until the mid-2000s. So there's a little bit of ambiguity as to when these things were recorded. Now, in his defense, he probably doesn't remember, or it wasn't marked down at the time. There would just be a rough figure. It doesn't really matter too much. But those unreleased tracks, there's no idea as to when these things were recorded. And we can just do kind of educated guesses based on what riffs he might be using, or the sound of his voice, or the equipment. Some of the earlier ones have a more synthetic drum machine. Tracks like Scary Mary sound a little bit more polished, perhaps a little bit more recent. So there are markers. I just wish it was a little bit more obvious in this booklet exactly when and how and why these things came to be. But overall, this is a nicely designed packaging. It's a very different mood to some of the previous solo stuff, but it's very kind of retro, vintagey. You might even say like looking back, which is exactly the mood that this album is. It's looking back at albums and songs written in the 2000s. Anyway, that is Francis Rossi of Status Quo, The Way We Were, Volume 1. I've given my rambly thoughts. What do you think? Are you really excited about this release? Did you really enjoy it? Or was something missing for you? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again for another episode of the Quo-Cast.